デイビット・マローン学長、よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you very much, and I'm very grateful to the translators for being with us today. I never speak from a prepared text, and it means that just as I improvise, the translators have to improvise, so I'm deeply grateful to them for taking on the challenge. And again, I'd like to thank Mayor Kadokawa, the universities represented here, the other constituents of Kyoto represented here, for the interest in the SDGs. And I'm going to try to illustrate for you where the SDGs come from. They actually have a history. They go back quite a long time to the first thinking about international development in the wake of the Second World War. But first, let me tell you that when I speak as an academic, I often feel personally like a fraud, because when I was young, I was a terrible student. At school, at high school, at my first degree in university, which I wasn't very interested in. I did other interesting things, but not in the classroom. I was a very bad student. And as a result of being a bad student, I could not get a scholarship to continue my studies. Young people love studying because it leaves them free. And I had to go to work when I was 21. And it was actually the experience of work that made me much more curious. I started asking myself questions that I had never asked before. Why this and not that? Why this country has that problem and the country next door has a very different problem? These sorts of issues. And so a few years later, 6 years later, with great enthusiasm this time, I went back to university in the United States rather than Canada. And I was lucky, I had some wonderful professors, and I worked very hard for a change, and I found the experience entirely gratifying. So what I had been lacking was beyond application, which is, a desirable human trait. I lacked curiosity, and I acquired that in the workplace. After being at university, I returned to work and really enjoyed my work, was quite energetic about it, and my studies contributed to that energy. And I was a few years later invited to teach, not as a tenured professor, but simply as a sessional lecturer at one of Canada's better universities, and I didn't feel qualified, but they were short of teaching staff. So to help them out, I agreed, and I discovered that I loved teaching, actually, that I loved the interaction with students, because their questions were also challenges to me. Had I thought about what they were worrying about? So it wasn't so much a question of question and answer, but question and reflection, and then perhaps half of an answer or a quarter of an answer. And teaching in North America is very interactive. It is a constant process of dialogue between students and professors, And that was something I enjoyed very much and felt I was learning from a great deal. And finally, after being my country's ambassador to the United Nations, when I was 41, I went back to school one last time to do a PhD. And I had an extraordinary supervisor. It was a life-altering experience to work with my supervisor, who managed to open up interests and capacities in me I didn't know I had. And from then on, my life was shared between my work for the Canadian government, work in universities, and work in think tanks, research institutions that are not university research institutions. Most of this in the United States, by the way. So just to be upfront with you, that far from being an expert, I'm a permanent student. I'm curious, but often I don't know. And it's that lack of knowledge that makes me more curious. So, you know, we all have different personality types, and I'm lucky that by chance I discovered that I did have an appetite for learning, but much later than it comes to most people. The first thing I want to say about development, international development, how the poorer countries of the world can become less poor and see their societies evolve, is to remind you that much of the world was colonized at the end of the Second World War. Even much of Asia, nearly all of Africa was colonized. Latin America had managed to shake off Portugal and Spain, but had remained underdeveloped in spite of becoming independent, most of the countries in the 19th century. And in Asia, it was a mix of countries that were still colonized, countries like Indonesia, colonized by the Netherlands, Malaysia, colonized by the British, Vietnam, colonized by the French, and that seems to us ancient history. But to those countries, that isn't ancient history. It's a deep wound that still hurts. And development is actually linked very much to the notion of decolonization, getting rid of the damage of colonization. I don't know what Japanese are taught about the colonization of Korea, but it was probably not an agreeable experience for Koreans, just as French colonization of Vietnam was not an agreeable experience for the Vietnamese. The case I studied most, because I was living in the country, was India. And colonization was a disaster for India. And until 25 years ago, we couldn't quantify how disastrous colonization of India had been. But about 30 years ago, some very obscure economists interested in history and obscure historians interested in economic factors influencing history got together in Paris with some money from the Organization for Cooperation, Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, to study what had been actually the process and the extent, the quantity of impoverishment that colonization brought about. And they started with two countries. They started with China and India. China was not fully colonized, but as we know, it was dominated economically by Western powers from basically early in the 19th century until late in the 19th century. India was colonized from roughly 1750 to 1947, so about 200 years. These economists and historians, through modeling, estimated how much China and India had each been contributing to global production in 1750, before colonization took full hold. China, they concluded, had been contributing somewhere between 23 and 25% of global production in centuries before 1750. And India, it was harder to quantify, had been contributing 17 to perhaps 22% of global production. So the window is wider. By the time the colonial influence ceased on these two countries, China in 1945 with the emergence, the success of the communist insurgency in China and India with independence in 1947. By then, China was contributing slightly more than 2% only of global production, and India was contributing 1.7% of global production. That tells you just how devastating colonization is to the colonized. So for those of us who think, oh, well, it was their bad luck and they benefited from our civilization is so fabulous, and we taught them lots of stuff, all you need to know is those figures of what colonization achieves. So international development as a concept coincided with the beginnings of decolonization. Decolonization happened not as a result of the Second World War, although the Second World War contributed to it by making it impossible for countries like Britain and France to continue, but because the Americans wanted it to stop. And why did the Americans want it to stop? They thought it was immoral. The United States was the product of a revolution against colonial London, and so they had that in their DNA. But there was a second reason. They thought that France, Britain, Belgium, these countries had an economic advantage in competition with the United States provided by their colonial holdings. So they wanted to eliminate that artificial advantage in competition, and they were able at the end of the Second World War to make that happen very quickly. End of empire. So, and of course Japan ended, as we know, its occupation of Manchuria and its colonization of South Korea at that point. So that was largely an American project, and we overlook that also. And that's what makes research so interesting. There's so much we don't know, and that if we are curious enough and make a little effort, we can find out a great deal more, and that's what goes on routinely in universities and research institutions all the time. When the UN was created in 1945, the notion of international development barely existed. The year before, at Bretton Woods, which is close to Washington, there had been a conference known as the Bretton Woods Conference, which created three economic institutions: the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which we call the World Bank today, the International Monetary Fund, which is still the International Monetary Fund, and an international trade organization which didn't happen for many years, but then emerged in the early 1990s as the World Trade Organization, WTO, which Japan has been a very active participant in. But none of this was about development. IBRD was about post-war reconstruction in Europe and Japan. The IMF was about financial stability globally, and they were thinking mainly of the rich countries. They weren't thinking of the poor countries. And trade, they were thinking, again, principally about the more wealthy parts of the world, because nobody was very preoccupied with what Africa might be able to contribute to this. So development emerged as a result of decolonization, and in particular decolonization of three countries, India, Pakistan, and what was then called Ceylon, and what today we call Sri Lanka. Those three countries became independent in 1947 and 1948, and it was clear they had big economic problems. India had experienced a famine in 1943 that killed somewhere between 1 and 3 million people. Pakistan had all sorts of problems of its own, and so did Sri Lanka. So the first development project that we can think of was the Colombo Plan. It was simply a plan to provide food assistance to those three countries to try to make sure there was never starvation again in these countries, and that lives would not be lost because of the lack of food. That was the first project that we can identify as a project linked to the process of international development. By the way, it still exists in another form and has a secretariat in Colombo, but we won't go into that. Very rapidly at the UN, people started thinking about, well, what happens when Africa becomes independent? How will they manage economically? Will they starve? What are our ideas at the UN to help these countries? And frankly, there were no ideas. And what researchers and scientists always think of when they encounter a new problem is, would experimentation help us? And so actually what happened during the 1950s was very small scale experimentation in a number of decolonized countries with what might work and what wouldn't work. It focused primarily on issues like agriculture, but it went also into public health. But these were not expensive programs. Very little money was being spent on them, but the results were encouraging. And with the decolonization of over 100 countries by 1965, well over 100 countries, there was huge international pressure to ramp up development assistance, to move from experimentation to large-scale activity. And that happened during the 1960s and 70s. A number of institutions were created. The World Bank's formal mandate didn't change, but all of its work changed because Europe had been reconstructed and Japan had largely reconstructed itself. So the World Bank was looking for a new mission because organizations don't like to disappear. And it became a development bank, not the original intention at all. Likewise, international development banks in each region emerged. Probably the best known in Japan, and one dominated by Japan still, it's a very good development bank, is the Asian Development Bank. It now has competition from another, actually very promising development bank in Asia. But for a long time, it was the big gorilla on development financing in Asia and did a very good job of it, and still does do a very good job of it. So new institutions were created to create the capacity to fund large-scale projects in developing countries. But again, there was an element of experimentation. So the intuition of leaders in developing countries, starting with Mr. Nehru in India, who had a very clear game plan, was that developing countries should imitate industrialized countries, and they should make a great leap forward into industrialization. So that was India's project. It also still worried about agriculture. So fitfully and through research, Indian institutions grew up experimenting on what locally could work, and American foundations supported a lot of research by international researchers on agriculture in countries like Mexico and India, one of whom won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work, Norman Borlaug, in the 1960s. And all of this was quite successful on agriculture, but it didn't work on industrialization. Why didn't it work on industrialization? Well, infrastructure was so weak in India that even if you had industrial production in the country, you often couldn't get the product from the factory to the port and out to international markets to generate income. So the lack of infrastructure was a very major problem in the developing world that in the 1950s had not seemed to be a big problem. So it was only by experimenting with industrialization that we discovered that in very poor countries, it couldn't work immediately. In Asia, many countries, first Taiwan and South Korea, when its war ended, decided to follow Japan's example of export-oriented industrialization rooted on very strong infrastructure. So both Taiwan and South Korea had a model they felt suited them, they followed it, it worked for them. Several countries of Southeast Asia later did likewise with local variations, because countries are quite different from each other. So they again were attracted to Japan's model and adopted aspects of it. So Japan in Asia played a huge role in suggesting ways forward for decolonized countries or otherwise poor countries that wish to be less poor. In Africa, there was no such field leader. In Latin America, there was no such field leader. And in a way, that may explain why, on balance over time, Asia has been more successful at economic development than either Africa or Latin America. But happily, Africa's prospects look much better now, and Latin America's prospects have always been good. It's a question of internal organization. So large-scale development planning got going, and projects got going, and countries did start to grow. But there was a big problem. They borrowed to buy themselves the infrastructure necessary to be productive, and they borrowed indiscriminately. They borrowed too much. They borrowed from governments, they borrowed from private banks, they borrowed from anybody who would lend them money. And the result was, by the 1980s, the early 1980s, they could no longer pay their debts. And it was not just one or two countries, it was nearly all of the countries. And that applied in Asia nearly as much as it applied in Africa and Latin America. And this was the biggest crisis in international development since 1945, and there hasn't been a bigger one since. Huge amounts of debt, and debt that needed to be, in one way or another, repaid or managed. And it took about 6 years of consultation amongst banks, governments, developing countries, to come up with a strategy. The strategy was quite simple, but it required very tight coordination between private lenders and official lenders, organized into two different clubs, private lenders in the London Club, public lenders, countries and development banks in the Paris Club. Not easy to engineer, but essentially two techniques were adopted. One, debt rescheduling, so much longer time frames to repay. Secondly, quite a lot of debt forgiveness. We just write off the debt. Now, none of this was popular either in the industrialized world or in developing countries, because in developing countries it was accompanied by ideas of structural adjustment, ideas of financial repression, which were very, very painful for the populations. So the governments knew they had no alternative, but the populations suffered a lot over this period of addressing the problems of created by the debt crisis. And that is when another group of researchers around the great Indian development economist Amartya Sen said, guys, debt is important, but it's not the most important thing in this discussion. The most important thing is the human being. Human development is actually much more important than economic development. So we challenge the orthodoxy. You've all been partly right, but completely wrong in ignoring basic human needs. And now we want basic human needs tended to. And that dialogue took place at the United Nations and led to something known as the Annual Human Development Report, which came as a surprise to the World Bank, the IMF, and others, but today they've largely adopted that thinking, interestingly. So all of this is a constant exchange of ideas based on experience, good experience, bad experience, also active experimentation. There is no science of international development. It has been trial and error all along. The Millennium Development Goals emerged in the year 2000 out of the realization that it's not the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank that causes a country to develop, it's the country itself that causes the country to develop. So it was important for these countries to establish their program of action. And the Millennium Development Goals was largely a program of action addressing critical problems in the developing countries, rather than what the development banks wanted to do or what the IMF thought they should be doing. They were widely expected not to succeed. They were quite simple, 8 goals, 21 targets, specific targets, and to the surprise of everybody, they did succeed, largely. Some of them failed, but overwhelmingly the majority of the 21 targets were reached. But there's a hidden reason why they were reached, and that is because economic growth took off in Asia and in Africa very strongly between the years 2000 and 2015. The indigenous economic growth is what allowed the goals to be achieved, and the goals were helpful in organizing thinking in the countries involved. The Sustainable Development Goals, which I want to end with, occur in a different climate and were negotiated in a different way. Experts shaped the Millennium Development Goals, whereas the Sustainable Development Goals resulted from a rather messy, often contentious negotiation between governments. And the result was many goals, 169 targets, so hugely ambitious, very difficult for governments to deal with. And also, since 2015, a slowdown in global growth, which may accelerate now with the coronavirus episode, which is striking developing countries now, as well as industrialized ones. So for everything we think is new, there is a history usually. And the history is relevant, and the history in a way inspires humility, because it illustrates that we are more often wrong than right, but by recognizing we are wrong and moving on and thinking again, then we are more likely to get it right the second or third time. And that is the story of international development, where the SDGs came from, and where we are today, which is frankly in an unpromising situation for attainment of the SDGs. So thank you very much indeed for your attention.